I have spent 41 years in the law, and I will tell you plainly. I have written wills for dying earls, contracts for the purchase of Highland estates, and 3 separate settlements involving brothers who wanted one another hanged. None of it prepared me for the autumn I watched Edmund Cale, 7th Duke of Thornhaven, sit on the steps of his own cathedral in a borrowed coat, and wait to see if a schoolmaster's daughter would notice him. He had not meant for me to know. That was the first thing. He arrived in the city on a Tuesday morning in early September, when the mist still lay across the Thorn River, and the cobbles of Cathedral Close were slick and gray as old pewter. I was leaving my office. I keep rooms above the chandler's shop on Minster Lane, have done for 20 years, and I nearly walked into him. He was thinner than I remembered, which was saying something. Edmund Cale in his natural state was not a broad man. He had the build of a scholar who had once been obliged to learn swordsmanship and had not entirely forgiven the obligation. But the coat he wore that morning hung at the shoulders, and his cravat, though clean, was tied without any particular ambition. He caught my arm before I could speak his name aloud. "Not here," he said very quietly. I had known him since we were both 11 years old, thrown together at a school in York because our fathers had gone to the same school, and apparently felt their sons should suffer accordingly. I knew every register of Edmund Cale's voice. That one meant, do exactly as I say and do not ask questions in the street. I steered him into my office and shut the door. "You look," I said carefully, "as though you have recently lost a considerable sum of money." "I have recently lost a considerable reputation," he said, sitting down in the chair across from my desk as though his bones were older than the rest of him. "The money can be recovered. The reputation is proving more inconvenient." I poured him tea. He did not speak again until he had drunk half of it. The story he told me was not, in its bare bones, unusual. A creditor, a man named Follick, who had done business with Edmund's late uncle, the 6th Duke, had put it about in London that the Thornhaven estate was mortgaged to the ceiling, and that the new Duke had concealed the fact from 3 separate parties who had entered into contracts on the estate's behalf. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie because I had drawn up Edmund's inheritance documentation myself, 2 years prior, and the estate was solvent to a degree that would have made Follick weep with envy. But Follick was clever, and he had friends in the press, and by the time Edmund's own solicitors in London had begun to assemble the counter-evidence, the story had run in 4 newspapers and been repeated at every table in 3 clubs. "I need to be here," Edmund said, "to settle the last portion of my uncle's affairs, a property dispute in the Thorn Valley that my London men cannot resolve without my signature and my presence. But I cannot arrive as myself. Not yet. Follick has men watching my movements, and if I appear in Thornhaven before the London counterclaim is filed, he will have grounds to delay the filing by claiming I have acted in bad faith." I looked at him over my teacup. "And so your solution is to arrive as what precisely?" "As no one," he said. "As a man of modest means passing through the city. I have rooms at the top of Mrs. Glover's house on Minster Lane. She does not know who I am, and I paid 3 weeks in advance in coin, so she has not asked. I need perhaps 6 weeks, 8 at the most. The counterclaim will be filed, Follick's evidence will be demolished, and I will then resume being myself." I set down my cup. "Edmund, this is the city your family has held the patronage of for 200 years. Everyone in Thornhaven knows your face." "Everyone in Thornhaven," he said calmly, "knows the face of the Duke of Thornhaven. They do not expect to see that face on the cathedral steps in a second-hand coat." He was not wrong. I have thought about it many times since, the particular blindness of expectation, the way we do not see what we are not prepared to see. The cathedral steps in early September were a known gathering point for those fallen on hard times. A fire had destroyed a row of lodging houses the previous winter, and several men and 1 elderly woman made their pitch there most mornings, and the city had grown accustomed to walking past. Edmund, thin and quiet in the wrong coat, was simply added to what was already not being looked at. I agreed to keep his confidence. I was not entirely happy about it. There were legal implications I preferred not to examine too closely. But I had known Edmund Cale for 30 years, and I had watched him spend most of those years being quietly more decent than anyone gave him credit for, which is the particular fate of powerful men whose faces arrange themselves naturally into severity. I agreed, and I went about my business, and for the first 3 days I barely thought of him. On the 4th day, I saw the girl. I should not call her a girl. Miss Maren Ashby was 26 years old, the eldest daughter of Cornelius Ashby, who held the post of cathedral schoolmaster and lived in the narrow house on Minster Lane with his wife and 2 younger daughters. I had known the Ashby family by sight for years. The schoolmaster occasionally consulted me on small matters of property inheritance, nothing complex. But I had not paid particular attention to the eldest daughter beyond noting that she was plainly dressed, walked with purpose, and did not seem to require the approval of the street to go about her business. On that 4th morning, I was crossing the cathedral close when I saw her come down the steps from early service. She was wearing her gray wool coat. It was always the gray coat. She had, I would eventually learn, exactly 3 coats, and the gray was the working one, and she was carrying a small market basket, which suggested she was heading to the stalls in Minster Square before school hours. She walked at the pace of a woman who had organized her time correctly and was now executing her plan. She slowed as she passed the cathedral steps. I watched her stop. She looked not at Edmund specifically, I thought, but at the row of figures there, the same way you might look at a sentence you have already read and want to make sure you have read correctly. Then she reached into the pocket of the gray coat and drew out a coin, not the penny or the halfpenny I would have expected, but a 6pence. And she crossed the 2 or 3 steps to where Edmund sat with his tin and dropped it in. She did not speak. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply dropped the coin and walked on toward Minster Square, and the efficiency of the movement was such that it was over before Edmund had fully registered that it had happened. I watched him look at the tin. Then I watched him look up in the direction she had gone. He did not see me across the close. I turned and went back to my office, and I thought about what I had seen, and I decided it was nothing remarkable. A charitable woman with a 6pence to spare. The world contained several. She came back the next morning. And the morning after that. I did not make a study of it at first. I was busy. The Thorn Valley property dispute required a quantity of paperwork that kept me occupied past the dinner hour on most evenings, and I was in and out of the cathedral close on legitimate business of my own often enough that I simply noticed, the way one notices the weather, that Miss Ashby stopped at the steps each morning and dropped a coin in the tin and walked on. Always the same economy of movement. Always wordless. Always, as far as I could observe, without any particular expression of pity or performance of generosity. She did not look around to see if anyone had noticed her charity. She put the coin in the tin and went to the market. It was the end of the 2nd week, before I allowed myself to connect what I was observing to what I knew. I went to Edmund's rooms on a Thursday evening. Mrs. Glover's house was respectable but narrow, and the top room where Edmund lodged had a window that looked out over the lane at an angle that offered a partial view of the cathedral close. He was at the window when I arrived, which I noted. "The Ashby girl," I said without prelude. He turned from the window with an expression that I recognized from 30 years of friendship as the one he wore when he had been caught at something, and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Schoolmaster's daughter," he said. "Yes. I have been watching her walk to market," he said, very carefully, "because there is very little else to watch from this window, and the alternative is the chandler's delivery cart, which is less instructive." "I see," I said. I sat down in the one chair the room contained. "And have you learned anything instructive from watching her walk to market?" He did not answer immediately. He came away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, There was nowhere else to sit, and he looked at his hands for a moment, which was another thing he did when he was deciding what to admit. "She is the only one," he said at last. I waited. Every morning, every person who passes those steps, merchants, clergymen, lawyers, he glanced at me briefly, wives, mothers, young men, old men. Every single one of them looks past. I have been sitting on those steps for 12 days, Silas, and in 12 days not one person has stopped, not one has looked. He paused. Except her. I said nothing. "She doesn't know me," he said. "I want to be perfectly clear about that. She has no idea who she is giving that sixpence to. She is not being kind to the Duke of Thornhaven. She is being kind to a man in a bad coat sitting on stone steps." "Yes," I said. "That is a different thing entirely," he said. "It is," I agreed. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the cathedral clock began the long business of striking 9. "Edmund," I said when it had finished, "you have been in this city for 12 days, and you are watching a schoolmaster's daughter walk to market." "I know," he said. "This is not what I would describe as a stable legal strategy." "I know," he said again. I went home. I thought about it for several days, and I watched Edmund at the cathedral steps. I passed that way now more than strictly necessary, I will admit, and I began to understand something that I am not sure I can articulate precisely even now, 40 years a lawyer and trained in the precise articulation of things. Edmund Cale was not a man who had ever been seen. I do not mean that he was ignored. No duke is ignored. I mean something more specific. He was seen as the Duke, always and only as the Duke, and the dukedom filled every room he entered so completely that the man inside it never had quite enough air. He had been raised to the title at 22, which is young to bear it, and the years since had been spent in a kind of perpetual performance, not a dishonest one but a demanding one. The people who surrounded him saw what he owed them, or what he could give them, or what they feared from him. His own household saw the title. His London solicitors saw the estate. His acquaintances in the clubs saw the scandal that Follick had manufactured. Not a single one of them saw, as far as I could determine, a man of 38 who was quietly reading in the evenings and walking the Thorn Valley in the mornings, and keeping a sixpence that he never spent in the bottom of a tin can. Miss Ashby, who did not know him at all, dropped her coin in the tin every morning and walked on, and it was the most honest thing that had happened to him in years. I began, I confess, to pay more attention to her. She was not beautiful in the way the city's fashionable set deployed the word. She had her father's broad forehead and her mother's somewhat uncompromising jaw, and her hair was the color of old oak bark, and she wore it pinned with a practical efficiency that suggested she thought about it for exactly as long as necessary and not a moment longer. But she had the kind of face that, once you had looked at it properly, rearranged your sense of what properly meant. Her eyes were the dark amber of Michaelmas leaves, and she had the habit, when she was thinking, of the faintest compression at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, exactly, but the precursor to one, as though the thought was being assessed before it was allowed expression. She taught at her father's school 3 mornings a week, the younger girls, reading and figures and a little French, and on the other mornings she managed the household, since her mother's health was uncertain, and her younger sisters were 17 and 14, and occupied largely with being 17 and 14. The city knew her as responsible and sensible and a little too plainly dressed for her age, and did not, I suspected, know much more about her than that. Edmund had learned rather more. I discovered this on an evening in the 3rd week when I arrived at his rooms to find him in the middle of a sketch. He had always had some talent with a pencil, and in the absence of other occupation it had apparently reasserted itself. He had drawn the schoolmaster's house. He had drawn it with some accuracy, including the window on the upper left, where a lamp burned late on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, which I had not previously observed, and which Edmund must have tracked from the angle of the cathedral close. That is an upper window, I said. The eldest daughter's room, he said, and then seemed to hear himself. He set the pencil down. She reads late, he said. The lamp is the last one out. Edmund. I know. What is it that you know precisely? Because from my position the situation is as follows. The Duke of Thornhaven is in hiding in a garret in Minster Lane, drawing pictures of a schoolmaster's house. He stood up and went to the window. Outside, September was cooling toward October, and the city smelled of wood smoke and river water. She gave her coin to a man she thought had nothing, he said. Every morning. No hesitation, no performance, no looking around to see if anyone noticed her virtue. She just dropped it in. He turned back. Silas, when is the last time anyone gave me something without wanting something for it? I considered the question seriously. I gave you a book of Virgil for your birthday 3 years ago. You gave that to Edmund Cale, he said, not to whoever this is. He gestured at the coat hanging on the peg by the door. It was, in its way, one of the most illuminating conversations I had with him in 30 years of friendship. I went home that evening and I poured myself a glass of port, and I sat by my own window, and I thought about the particular mathematics of what Edmund Cale was describing. He had an estate and a title and a legal fight that he was, by all accounts, going to win. He had, when the dust settled, everything that the world had arranged for him to have. And the thing that undid him, the thing that had loosened some held-back portion of himself that I had not known was held, was a sixpence from a woman who thought he was nobody. The 4th week arrived, and October with it. The cathedral city of Thornhaven had its own particular genius of autumn. The stone of the close went the color of honey in the afternoon light, and the great west window of the cathedral caught the late sun and threw colored light across the steps in the early evening, which I had always found unexpectedly moving for a man of my professional temperament. The market on Saturdays expanded to include the apple sellers from the Thorn Valley, and the smell of the city in those weeks was apples and smoke and cold water, and has been, to my memory, ever since. Edmund had begun to take longer routes back from the cathedral steps. This was observable because his rooms were 3 minutes from the cathedral close by the direct route, and he was increasingly returning by a route that took him past Minster Lane's northern end, which added perhaps 10 minutes, and which brought him past the Ashby house on what he would have claimed was a convenient thoroughfare but which I had measured and could confirm was not. I said nothing about this because there seemed to be nothing useful to say. He had learned by this time rather more about her than proximity could explain. I deduced that he had been talking to Mrs. Glover, his landlady, who was a woman of comprehensive civic knowledge, and the view that information was best circulated freely. From Mrs. Glover, and I constructed this partly from what Edmund said, and partly from what Mrs. Glover subsequently said to me, having formed the impression that I was an associate of her lodgers and therefore a suitable repository. From Mrs. Glover, Edmund had learned the following: that Miss Ashby had been engaged briefly at the age of 22 to a young curate from York, and that the engagement had ended when the curate secured a parish in Devon, and Miss Ashby declined to leave her family, her mother being ill, that she had been offered the same engagement again, with some modifications, 2 years later, and had declined again, that she had a talent for figures which her father considered wasted on the younger girls but which he could not well spare, that she gave each Michaelmas a quantity of her own preserved summer fruit to 3 families in the old cloth quarter who could not afford the autumn markets, and that she had not, as far as the city could observe, formed any subsequent attachment and did not appear to be seeking one. She gave up an engagement twice, Edmund said to me one evening, in the tone of a man examining a mathematical proof, because she would not leave. Her mother needed her. She would not leave what she was responsible to, he said. He looked at me. That is not what people do, Silas. People leave. People rearrange their obligations. Some people don't, I said. She doesn't, he said. I thought of the gray coat, the market basket, the economy of movement, the lamp burning last in the upper window. No, I said. She doesn't. There was a pause that lasted long enough to become significant. You should know, I said carefully, that the counterclaim is proceeding well. My correspondent in London expects filing within 3 weeks. He nodded. Which means, I continued, that within perhaps 5 or 6 weeks, you will cease to be a man in a borrowed coat on a cathedral step and resume being the Duke of Thornhaven. He looked at the window. Edmund, I said, tell me what you are thinking. He was quiet for a long time. The cathedral clock measured the silence in quarter hours. She gives the coin without looking, he said finally. Every morning. No eye contact, no waiting for thanks. She simply places it and goes, as though it is owed. Not to me specifically, but to the fact of someone needing. He paused. I have never met anyone who gave like that, who gave as though it were simply part of the correct order of things. She is a good woman, I said. She is the only person in this city, he said quietly, who has treated me as a human being in 4 weeks. I set down my pen. I had brought papers to review while we talked, and I looked at my oldest friend, the Duke of Thornhaven, sitting in a rented room in a borrowed coat with a tin on the windowsill, and I understood something that I should perhaps have understood earlier. He was not going to be able to put the tin away and become the Duke again, and walk past Miss Ashby on the cathedral close without saying anything. He was constitutionally incapable of it, and whatever came next, it was going to require my assistance, because Edmund Cale's judgment in matters other than law and estate management had historically benefited from supervision. What do you intend to do? I said. He turned from the window. His expression was the one I associated with decisions already made and now merely being announced. I am going to wait, he said, until I can do it properly. 3 weeks. The counterclaim was filed on a Wednesday, and by Friday of that week, Follick's evidence had been so thoroughly dismantled in the legal correspondence. I say this without false modesty, as I had assisted materially in the dismantling, that the matter would be concluded within the month. Edmund's London solicitors sent word that the Duke of Thornhaven was free to resume his public movements. He did not move immediately. The Michaelmas Assembly was in 10 days. I did not know this had significance until he told me. Thornhaven held a Michaelmas Assembly in the first week of October, an old tradition dating to the cathedral's early years, in which the city's principal families gathered in the assembly rooms on Minster Gate for an evening of music and the customary announcements of the season: marriages, births, new appointments, the year's charitable distributions. The schoolmaster and his family attended. Every notable family in the city attended. It was, Edmund said, with the peculiar calm of a man who had thought something through very thoroughly, the correct occasion. The correct occasion for what? I said. For doing it in front of everyone, he said. I looked at him for a long moment. Edmund, I said, she does not know who you are. I know. She has been dropping a coin in your tin for 6 weeks under the impression that you are a man of no particular standing. Yes. And you intend to walk into the Michaelmas Assembly as the Duke of Thornhaven, and what precisely? He was quiet for a moment. Name her, he said, in front of the city, in front of everyone who has walked past those steps without looking. I want them all to understand what she did. I absorbed this. And what about what she wants? I said. You are proposing to walk into a room and name a woman publicly before she has any knowledge of who you are or what you intend. That is, Edmund, that is a considerable presumption. He looked at me steadily. I know, I am asking your opinion because you are the person whose opinion I respect. What do you think I should do? I considered it. I thought about a woman who had given up an engagement twice rather than leave her responsibilities, who dropped a coin in a tin without looking for gratitude, who burned her lamp late in the upper window over a book I would never know the title of. I think, I said slowly, that you should not name her without some preliminary indication that the naming would be welcome. She doesn't know me. Then perhaps she should, I said. Before the assembly. He was quiet for a moment, then how? And that, I will confess, is where I made the only decision in the whole business that I am not entirely certain was wise. I told him to introduce himself, not as the Duke, not yet, but as himself, to take the longer route past the Ashby house, and when the occasion presented itself naturally, to speak to Miss Ashby as Edmund Cale and let her draw her own conclusions about the man, before the title complicated matters. He looked at me with the expression of a man being asked to do something he simultaneously knows is correct and finds extremely difficult. "Talk to her," he said. "Talk to her," I said. He did on the following Tuesday morning, and the circumstances of it were sufficiently awkward that I heard the full account that evening and have carried it with me as one of the more instructive conversations I have known about. He was coming back from the cathedral steps, the morning's coin already deposited in the tin, and he had begun, I knew, to find excuses to be slightly away from the tin at the moment of the deposit, because he had discovered that receiving the coin while looking at her was more than he could manage with any composure, and she was coming from the opposite direction, from the market. And they met at the corner of Minster Lane and Cathedral Close, with the kind of geometric exactness that only happens when two people have, without entirely acknowledging it, been arranging their routes with the other in mind. He stopped. He said afterward that he had prepared no particular opening, which I believed entirely. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. A pause in which he reported, "A cart went by and a pigeon expressed an opinion." "I believe," he said, "that you pass the cathedral steps each morning." She looked at him. He had the impression, he described it with some care, that she was assessing him in the straightforward way that a person assesses a mathematical problem, not unkindly but without any particular decoration. "I do," she said. "I wanted to say," he said, and then stopped, because he had not entirely decided what he wanted to say. She waited. She had, he told me, the particular patience of someone who has spent a great deal of time with children who are still assembling their sentences. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the amber eyes. "It was 6pence," she said. "You needn't thank me for 6pence." "It wasn't the 6pence," he said. Another pause. "No," she said after a moment, "I don't expect it was." She shifted the market basket to her other arm. "Are you well? You look better than you did a month ago." He had not, I gathered, been prepared for this observation. "Better," he said. "Less," she considered. "Less as though the weight of something were pressing directly on the back of your neck," she said. "Whatever it was, it appears to have eased." He stared at her. She was looking at him with an expression that was entirely straightforward, and without any apparent understanding of what she had just described. "It has," he said. "It has eased considerably." "Good," she said. She adjusted the basket again. "My name is Marin Ashby. My father is the schoolmaster." "I know," he said, and then heard himself. "That is, I have seen you at service. In the cathedral. I attend early service when I can." This was true. He had begun attending early service in the 3rd week, which I had thought unremarkable and which I now understood differently. "Yes," she said, "I thought I had seen you there." She tilted her head slightly. "What is your name?" He told her. Edmund Cale. No title, no estate, simply the 2 words, delivered in the tone of a man handing something over carefully. She repeated it just once, testing it. "Mr. Cale." Then, "I must get these home before the lesson bell. Good morning, Mr. Cale." "Good morning, Miss Ashby," he said. She walked past him and down Minster Lane toward the schoolmaster's house. He stood at the corner for, by his own account, approximately 2 full minutes, watching the gray coat disappear. Then he came to tell me about it with the expression of a man who has recently survived something he is not sure he deserved to survive. They spoke again on Thursday, and on Saturday briefly at the market. She was buying apples from the Thorn Valley cellars, and he was there because I am not entirely sure he had any business being at the market, but he was there. And they spent perhaps 7 minutes discussing the relative merits of 2 varieties of late apple, with the seriousness that the subject may or may not have warranted. She knew by then that he had been staying at Mrs. Glover's. She knew that he was in the city on business, the nature of which he described vaguely, and she did not press. She knew that he had studied law in his younger years. This was both true and somewhat understated, but accurate, and that he had spent several months in difficult circumstances, which was also both true and understated. What she did not know was that the circumstances had been largely manufactured by a scheming creditor, that they had now been largely resolved, and that Edmund Cale was the 7th Duke of Thornhaven and the primary patron of the very cathedral on whose steps she had been dropping a daily sixpence. I began to wonder whether he was going to tell her before the Michaelmas Assembly, or whether the assembly itself was still the plan. On the Thursday evening before the assembly, he came to my office and sat in the chair across from my desk, and was quiet for long enough that I set down my pen and gave him my full attention. "She looked at me today," he said, "and said that she thought the legal matter must be nearly resolved because I was standing differently." I considered this, standing differently. "Differently," he said, "more squarely. Those were her words. She said I was standing as though I had remembered something important." I waited. "She is," he said, in the tone of a man arriving at an arithmetical conclusion, "extraordinary." "Yes," I said. "She watches," he said. "She has been watching me for 6 weeks without my knowledge, and she has catalogued things about me that I did not know were observable. The weight at the back of my neck, the way I stand, she notices." He paused. "No one notices, Silas. People look, but no one notices." "Some people do," I said. He looked at me. "I cannot walk into the assembly and name her without warning her." "No," I said. "I told you that 3 weeks ago." "I need to tell her before," he said. "I need to tell her who I am, what I am, and I need to tell her that the coin in the tin, that what she did," he stopped. "I need her to understand what it meant, before the whole city tells her who she gave it to." "When?" I said. He looked at the calendar on the wall of my office. The Michaelmas Assembly was in 2 days. "Tomorrow," he said, "in the morning at the corner of Minster Lane." I nodded. He stood up and put on the borrowed coat, which had by now become less borrowed and more simply his. He had worn it so consistently that Mrs. Glover had pressed it twice and mended the cuff, and it had taken on the shape of him. "Silas," he said at the door, "if she tells me to go away." "She won't," I said. He looked at me. "She noticed the weight at the back of your neck," I said. "She doesn't give that kind of attention to people she intends to send away." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went out, and I heard his footsteps on the stair, and I sat in my office with the evening coming in through the window, and thought that I had spent 41 years practicing law, and the most consequential advice I had ever given was, talk to her. I was not there for the Friday morning conversation. I have his account of it, given to me that same afternoon in a voice that was notably less steady than his usual register. He had found her at the corner of Minster Lane as planned. She had her market basket and her gray coat, and the expression of a woman who is already 3 tasks into her morning and is assessing the 4th. He had said, "Miss Ashby, before you go to market, I have something to tell you, and I want to tell you before tomorrow evening, because tomorrow evening you will hear it from someone else, and I should prefer you to hear it from me." She had set down the basket and looked at him with the full amber attention of her eyes. He had told her. All of it, the title, the estate, Fawlix manufactured scandal, the 6 weeks in Mrs. Glover's garret, the cathedral steps, the counterclaim, the resolution. He told it plainly, in the organized way he did everything, and he watched her face while he told it. She was quiet for a long time after he stopped. "The tin on the cathedral steps," she said. "Yes." "You were the Duke of Thornhaven," she said. "I am the Duke of Thornhaven," he said. "The circumstances were temporary." Another silence. He said he was not sure what she was thinking. Her face had closed in a way he had not seen before, which frightened him more than he had anticipated being frightened. "For 6 weeks," she said, "every morning." "Yes." "And you never said anything." "I could not," he said. "The legal circumstances required I could not be known, and then by the time the circumstances eased, He stopped. "I wanted to be Edmund Cale a little longer," he said. "I wanted to be the man on the steps who you saw and did not look past. I was not ready to be the Duke again." She was quiet. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I know that what I have told you changes the nature of every conversation we have had. I know that is not a comfortable thing. I am not asking you to, I am not asking anything except that you hear this from me first." He paused. "I will be at the Michaelmas Assembly tomorrow evening, as myself, and I would like, very much, if you would allow me to speak to you there." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the tin, which was sitting on the 3rd step of the cathedral, the morning light catching its battered side. "I gave that tin a great deal of thought," she said slowly. "Over 6 weeks. I thought about who might be sitting there and what had brought them to it and what manner of person they were. I am a schoolmaster's daughter, Your Grace." "Edmund Cale," he said. "The title is accurate. The name is also accurate. I would not object to either." The faintest compression at the corner of her mouth, which he recognized now, after 6 weeks of careful observation, as the precursor to something. "I thought," she said, "that whoever was sitting on those steps had more dignity in their manner than most people I meet in drawing-rooms. And I thought that the way a person sits when they believe no one is watching them tells you a great deal more about them than the way they sit when they know they are observed." She picked up her market basket. "I will be at the Michaelmas Assembly, Mr. Cale." He said nothing. "My father attends every year," she said. "My sisters enjoy the music. I shall be there." She walked past him and down toward Minster Square. He stood at the corner for 2 minutes. This was, I gathered, becoming habitual. Then he came to tell me, and his voice had the particular quality that I had not heard from Edmund Cale since we were 11 years old, and he had won a difficult prize at school, and was trying not to show how much it mattered to him. The Michaelmas Assembly of that year was, by all accounts, one of the better attended in recent memory. The rooms on Minster Gate were warm with candlelight. 3 chandeliers had been relit after years of the single one being deemed sufficient, and the city's notable families were present in their best autumn clothes, and the musicians from the cathedral chapter had been engaged and were acquitting themselves respectably in the far corner. I arrived early, which is my habit. Edmund arrived precisely on time, which is his, and the effect of his arrival was not what you might call understated. He was in the Duke's dress, the full formal clothes of his station, the dark coat, the order ribbon across it, the cravat immaculate, and the last 6 weeks had taken whatever had been soft and uncertain at the edges of his manner, and replaced it with something quieter and more resolved. He looked, in short, like a man who had recently decided something important and was at peace with the decision. The room noticed. That is the only way to put it. The Duke of Thornhaven, returned from wherever rumor had placed him, walked through the assembly rooms on Minster Gate, and the room arranged itself around him, the way rooms always had and always would, and I watched several people begin to compose questions in their expressions that they did not yet dare ask aloud. He did not go to the center of the room. He went to one of the tall windows at the side and stood with his back to the glass, where he could see the door, and he waited. The Ashby family arrived 20 minutes later. The schoolmaster first with his wife on his arm. She was pale but dressed with evident care. Then the younger sisters, bright-eyed and already looking at the musicians. Then Marin, in what I can only describe as not the gray coat. I should be precise. She was dressed in dark green, a color that, as I had never had occasion to observe it on her before, I was unable to say whether it was her usual evening dress or something newly considered for the occasion. It had a simple cut, not fashionable in the current elaborate sense, but the kind of thing that had been made by someone who understood proportion. Her hair was up in its usual efficient arrangement, except that there was something slightly less efficient about it than usual. 2 or 3 strands had been permitted at the temples that were not, I judged, permitted at the school. She looked, in the simple summary of it, like herself, except that the self had been allowed a little more room than usual. I looked at Edmund. He was absolutely still at the window. She crossed the room with her family, speaking to her father, one hand briefly on her mother's arm to guide her to a chair. The economy of movement, the arrangement of the people she was responsible to, the same as always, as natural as breathing. Then she settled her mother and turned, and across the full width of the assembly room, looked directly at where Edmund was standing. He did not move, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. Then she turned back to her family, and Edmund, very quietly, separated himself from the window. The assembly progressed as it always did. The music played. The announcements were made. The cathedral's autumn charitable distribution, 2 engagements from the Nether Thorne families, the appointment of a new canon to the chapter. I stood near the back and watched Edmund move through the room with the controlled patience of a man who is waiting for something precise. He came to stand beside me during the musical interlude. "She is wearing green," he said in an undertone. "I noticed," I said. "She looked at me when she came in." "Yes." A pause. "I am going to speak to her father first," he said. "After the announcements, before it should be done in order." "That is sensible," I said. "And then I am going to speak to her." "Also sensible." Another pause. "Silas," he said, "what if she—" "Edmund," I said. "She is wearing green." He was quiet. "She thought about what to wear to the Michaelmas assembly," I said. "Miss Ashby has 3 coats and the gray is the working one and she is wearing green. You may draw your own conclusions." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are for a lawyer occasionally useful." "I appreciate the qualification," I said. The announcements concluded. The musicians began again. The room relaxed into conversation, and in the general motion Edmund crossed to where Cornelius Ashby stood with 2 other men, and I watched him introduce himself. The Ashby family had, apparently, never been formally in the Duke's company, which was not unusual. The schoolmaster and the Duke moved in different orbits, and I watched the schoolmaster's expression go through several revisions in rapid succession, before settling into the specific expression of a man who is trying to appear composed and is achieving perhaps 60% of this ambition. They spoke for several minutes. I could not hear. The schoolmaster's wife, seated nearby, turned to observe the conversation with an expression of fixed attention. Then Edmund excused himself, and he crossed the room, and he came to stand before Miss Ashby. She had been standing near the far window with one of her sisters, who, at Edmund's approach, found something urgently interesting in another direction with the natural instinct of younger siblings across all centuries. I moved unobtrusively a little closer. "Miss Ashby," Edmund said. "Mr. Cale," she said, "then Your Grace." "Either will do," he said. "I told you that." The compression at the corner of her mouth. "So you did." A brief silence in which the music provided, graciously, the sound that the moment required. "I want to say something," Edmund said, in the tone of a man who has prepared and is now aware that preparation is not going to be sufficient. I have been thinking about how to say it for several weeks. She waited, with the patience of the schoolmaster's daughter. You have been giving me a coin every morning for 6 weeks, he said, under the impression that I was a man who needed it. I want you to understand that I was a man who needed it, not the sixpence. He stopped, looked at his hands briefly, the way he always did when the precise word was arranging itself. The fact of being seen, he said, that is what I needed, and you were the only person in this city who provided it. She looked at him steadily. I have been the Duke of Thornhaven for 16 years, he said. I have met a great many people. I have been regarded and assessed and avoided and courted. I have not, he paused. I have not been given anything without expectation of return, until you. The amber eyes held his. She said nothing. I know that you did not know who I was, he said. I know that the knowledge changes things, and I am not asking you to. I am not presenting you with a decision you have not asked to make. I am simply, he took a breath. I would like to call on your father, formally, if you would permit it. A long moment. The candles in the nearest chandelier moved slightly, as candles do in rooms full of people, and the light shifted across her face. You have already spoken to my father, she said. Yes. He appeared to be in favor of the idea, she said. He is not a subtle man, my father. The corner of Edmund's mouth moved, not quite a smile, the same precursor she had been demonstrating to him. I noticed. Your Grace, she said, and then stopped. Edmund Cale, she looked at him. You sat on those steps for 6 weeks and said nothing because you wanted to be seen without the title for once in your life. Yes. And I saw you, she said, without knowing what I was seeing. You saw exactly what you were seeing, he said. That is what I am trying to tell you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the room around them, the candle-lit assembly of Thornhaven's notable families, who had by this point distributed their attention unevenly between the musicians and the window, where the Duke of Thornhaven was standing with the schoolmaster's eldest daughter, and something in her expression acknowledged this quietly, without alarm. My father will receive you on Monday morning, she said, after the lesson bell when the house is quieter. Monday morning, he said. Yes, she glanced at the window, then back. You should know that I intend to continue walking to market, by the same route. He was very still. The steps will be empty, she said. So I shall have no reason to stop. The compression at the corner of her mouth resolved, finally, all the way, into the thing it had always been the precursor to. Unless you happen to be passing. I was, I will admit, a sufficient distance away that I cannot tell you what Edmund Cale's expression did in the next moment. I can tell you that the assembly room of Thornhaven, on the occasion of its Michaelmas gathering, contained at least 40 people who were watching the Duke of Thornhaven and the schoolmaster's eldest daughter stand at the far window, and that the room had the particular quality of a collective held breath. I can tell you that Edmund turned, after a moment, and offered her his arm to walk to where the musicians were beginning a new piece. I can tell you that she took it. And I can tell you that in 41 years of practicing law, of drawing up wills and settlements and counterclaims and documents of every kind that attempt to put the arrangements of human lives into precise language, the clearest thing I have ever witnessed was a schoolmaster's daughter in a dark green dress take a duke's arm in a candle-lit room, and the expression on the face of that duke. I have never been able to describe it precisely. The best I have managed, and I have attempted it several times in the years since, is this. It was the expression of a man who had been seen, fully and without condition, and first, before the title made it complicated. He had wanted that for a long time. He had not known he was waiting for it, until she dropped a sixpence in a tin on the cathedral steps on a gray September morning, and walked on without looking back. They were married the following June, in the cathedral on the Close, in a ceremony attended by the entirety of Thornhaven and a considerable portion of the county, and the schoolmaster wept openly and made no attempt to conceal it. And Edmund Cale's expression was the same one I had seen at the Michaelmas assembly, carried forward unchanged through 8 months of courtship and planning, and 2 separate visits from Edmund's London solicitors, who needed to understand how it was that the Duke of Thornhaven had come to be engaged to a schoolmaster's daughter, and seemed, inexplicably, to consider this the most sensible thing he had ever done. After the ceremony in the vestry, while the family arranged themselves for the walk to the wedding breakfast, I saw Edmund take her hand. Just her hand briefly, while the others were occupied. She looked up at him. "All right," he said. It was a simple question. "Yes," she said, and then, "Were you nervous?" He considered. "I have conducted 16 years of estate management, 2 parliamentary inquiries, and a legal action against a professional swindler," he said. "I was not nervous for any of those." "And this morning," she said. "This morning," he said, "was different." She looked at him with the amber eyes. "Good," she said. "That seems right." And I, standing 4 feet away with the vestry register in my hand and my clerk's pen dripping ink onto the flagstone, thought, "Yes, that seems exactly right. I have kept the tin. Edmund gave it to me when he left Mrs. Glover's rooms in November, and I did not ask why and he did not explain, and I have had it on the corner of my desk in Minster Lane for 40 years, which is a long time to have a battered tin on a desk without a good reason. But I think the reason, when I examine it, is this. In 41 years of law, I have spent a great deal of time arranging the affairs of the living and the dead, managing what people leave behind and what they owe and what they are owed, and I have come to the conclusion that the most important transactions are the ones that do not appear in any document. A sixpence from a gray-coated woman on a September morning, the fact of being seen, for the first time in a long time, by someone who was not looking for anything in return. I keep the tin, because it is the truest account I possess of how a good man came to be known.